Good evening. Good evening. On behalf of the county, Canaan Associates and DPZ Co-Design, welcome to the third meeting of Series 3. My name is Marina Corey and I'm with DPZ, and I'm joined by Matt Lambert and Mike Wyke. From Canaan Associates, we have Eliza Giuliano with us, as well as many from the county, including Alberto, Olin, Greg, and others. We will also be helping to answer your questions during the 2 Q&A pauses that we have. All of us will. As a reminder, Series 1 introduced Vision 2050, Orange County's comprehensive plan and its objectives. Series 2 was an introduction to sectors and place types, both intended to provide guidance on the degree of intensity and density for the future growth within each of the 6 market areas in a more predictable and clear manner. And I encourage you all to go view the recordings at the Vision 2050 website. Series 3 is divided into 3 sets of 2 meetings. It's about the zoning code, which supports Vision 2050 and provides the regulations for zoning controls that guide development and conservation. So the first 2 meetings highlighted what our physical assessment of the county revealed. It explained the difficulties with the current code and introduced you to what is a form-based code and how the new code, which we're calling Orange Code, is organized around a powerful tool called the Transect, which essentially defines the different character zones within the county. Tonight and tomorrow's night's meetings describe the different zoning categories and their massing, their form, their height, and the permitted uses within each. The third set on July 7th and 8th will discuss all else that goes into zoning, subdivisions, parking, signage, and all that fun stuff. So we look forward to your participation, your collaboration, and your engagement with this team as we refine the new code, which will become the regulatory tool to enable the objectives in your comp plan that deal with issues as varied as sustainability, affordability, a vibrant public realm, housing choices, and increased walkability, to name a few. So we're live streaming across many platforms, and we're gathering questions in real time that we look forward to answering. So please put them into the comment section if you have them here, if you are on Facebook or in live or Facebook or YouTube, and in this webinar. And now I'm going to turn it over to Alberto Vargas, the Planning Director, for welcoming remarks and to acknowledge the commissioners who are also in attendance.
Thank you, Marina, and good evening, everyone. I am very excited to be here. We have great attendance tonight. Since last December to April of this year, we have been discussing the framework of how Orange County's comp plan is being reorganized in Vision 2050. And tonight, the discussion, as Marina introduced it, is really focused on the implementation of Vision 2050 and what are the mechanisms to get that vision in terms of the development that will occur in the next 30 years in Orange County. We have collectively recognized that Orange County is very diverse, not only in its topography, but the character of lifestyles that we have within the county. The development trends as well, they vary throughout the county. And this code, again, as introduced, is much more focused on the physical form, the physical design of the built environment. And rather than just what we're used to here in terms of the separation of uses, which tends to identify areas of residential, commercial, office, industrial, and so on. And here we're trying to identify areas of opportunities where those uses are integrated either vertically or horizontally. So the code updates really provides opportunities for us to expect development to be different and think differently when we are collectively reviewing the applications for those type of developments. And what this does, it really provides the opportunity to preserve those great communities that we have in Orange County, the natural environment as well. And as we continue to grow in the next 30 years, we have a much more predictable result of that environment for new communities that are much more sustainable, responsible, and healthy as we look into the future. So With that, tonight, I'm going to recognize Commissioner Maribel Gomez Cordero, who's here with us from District 4. Good evening, Commissioner, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Good evening, Alberto, and thank you all the staff and everyone attending. And thank you for all the hard work and everything you're doing to present this to the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your time tonight. And Commissioner Nicole Wilson is also with us tonight. Welcome back, Commissioner. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Alberto. I really look forward to the continued development of this. I think we have really narrowed in on residents' concerns about the natural spaces and human health and well-being and all how that plays into good planning. So I really appreciate all the time and energy that's gone into this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. And we have also representation of District 4, Rose Nancy Joseph, with the District Office of Commissioner Siplin. Thank you, Rose Nancy, for being with us tonight as well. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Lambert, who's going to conduct the presentation tonight.
Thanks, Alberto. Well, most of today is all really about the wonky word, the transect. Again, I said we'll get into codes. It gets a little wonky, but we'll try to keep it, as clear as possible. Now, we covered the transect as a concept in our last set of meetings, and that information is sort of a prerequisite for much of today. So if you didn't watch the first code presentation in May, be sure to watch that for some needed context on the transect. You should still be able to sort of catch what's going on in this meeting, but you can always go back on the Vision 2050 website and review that. It'll be really helpful context for today. So I'm going to go into cover just a couple of key points from that presentation first. That'll be some important background before we get on to details of how we apply this concept in Orange Code to the county. So as a reminder, this image is the standard transect, six divisions of intensity that's being used as a replacement for use-based zoning across the country, not just the county, but in many, many locations in the United States and elsewhere. Now, this categorizes different details of the built environment. Built environment's another wonky term, which means buildings, streets, open spaces, all the sorts of things, fences, lights, trees, and it coordinates them from areas of low intensity, that's T1's natural preserves or T2's rural areas, to areas of high intensity like T5's main streets or small downtown conditions. Last time I discussed the reason we focus on form. That is a better predictor of outcomes and compatibility. We discussed floor area ratio here, which is a typical way that codes handle development, and how this really does not address the character of new development, and outcomes based principally on FAR, not predictable. We also discussed density, which much like floor area ratio does not regulate character and therefore does not regulate compatibility. The examples used in last meeting are very useful, and I recommend that you revisit those. Density really is very misunderstood. And these were some slides from the last time on density, pointing out that the form of buildings can mitigate the impact of density. And we're not looking to densify existing neighborhoods. However, we are looking to densify the underdeveloped areas of the county's larger roadways, which are targets for growth. And in these areas, we want to accommodate fairly dense development so we can reduce the pressure to develop rural and natural lands and reduce pressure to develop in existing communities too. We also want to accommodate growth in these areas to support more efficient transit systems. In order to ensure new growth is compatible though with existing neighborhoods, we have to look principally at the form of new buildings, which is where the transect comes in as a tool. Using the transect, we can clearly identify that existing neighborhoods, on the left here, T3, are incompatible with being directly adjacent to high intensity development, like the example of T6 here that's shown on the right of the image. And we use this image to say when we have a compatible form, the specific uses, of course, this is more Main Street, so we expect T5 to be intense, but the specific uses within those buildings and the densities are really not that relevant to compatibility. It's the form that establishes compatibility. So we talked more about that last time. Again, go to the Vision 2050 website and watch that recording if you haven't caught it. That'll give you more background just on the Transect overall. And so we'll assume that information is background today and move forward to look at how Orange Code applies the Transect. So for those of you who are not very familiar with zoning, it's a designation applied to all property within unincorporated Orange County, and that determines what's allowable across a whole range of different topics. Normally, we talk about development and consider how zoning allows buildings of, say, 2 stories here or 4 stories there, or buildings covering a lot of their property or not being able to cover very much of their property at all. It's also correlated with use, like where commercial or industrial uses can be located. And zoning can also be used to allow or restrict other activities on private property, like raising animals. You can have cattle here, but not there. No cattle in a neighborhood, for instance. So in conventional zoning, which is on this image here, it's focused on use. Zoning mostly says commercial here in C1, multifamily there in R3, and single family over there in R1. And there isn't much mixing of those uses, and there's really no focus on the form of buildings. So while there's some clarity of future outcome, there's not really clarity on the form, and therefore no control of compatibility. So here's a quick example of some zones that exist, in a part of the county. While I think it might actually be in the city, but anyhow, that's still important to look at. And while you can clearly see the differences in the residential zones, you sort of see on the periphery, there's some houses have bigger lots and some houses have smaller lots, and you can single out the commercial zone. But you can see that most of this is the same commercial zone, and they have vastly different outcomes. So the same zone on the commercial side really has a variety of different outcomes. And it's a bit of a simplification, but it's aimed at showing that the form of commercial zoning is unpredictable and that there's not a lot of meaningful transition to the residential areas. And if there were transitions, say today, using today's use-based standards, it would be hard to deal with the differences of transitioning between different types of residential zones and commercial, but even between R1 and R2, the residential zones. And beyond that, you have a lot of planned development. So in the upper left-hand corner, that more dense housing is a planned development. If you look at that PD, you can see that there's not a meaningful transition on the right side of it to the R1 zone. Instead, there's really this clear line, right? There's smaller lots on the left, and that's in the PD, and there's larger ones on the right in the R1, and there's not a transition. There's a stark line of difference, and that's the same way that the housing goes to the commercial properties. So that sort of thing could result from applying zoning this way. You see C1 in the middle, that's commercial, to R3 and R1. This would certainly transition in intensity, but it would have no predictability of form. But if we took these same colors and same layout and use transect zones, which is based on intensity, then the outcome becomes more predictable, and the transitions are really able to be more clearly directed. So T5 in the center being that mixed use, commercial, multifamily, office mixed together in a form of buildings where the height is regulated, to T4, which is a mixture of different housing at different types, like townhouses, small multifamily buildings, and smaller single family, then to the T3, which is medium-sized single family and larger. And so this 3D massing sort of shows the outcome of using transect zoning in that sort of scenario. T5 is generally compatible sharing an edge with T4, which is generally compatible sharing an edge with T3. But if you put T3 next to T5, it really doesn't work out very well if you don't have a careful transition. So back to the Transect, this again is that 6-zone prototype, but the county's large. So we can't just say 6 zones and that's it, that's all you get in the county, right? So instead we've analyzed existing places and zoning to determine how many zones are really needed to cover the variations of character in the county, because we're not directing architecture with this, but we are directing intensity. And so if you sort of take the sort of architecture skin off and you think about how tall buildings are and how much of their property they take up and how far they're set back from the street, then we can simplify that set of differences. So we were actually able to fulfill most of those needs by splitting each of these 6 zones into 3 divisions. So this retains that overall intensity of the transect, but it provides for more granularity, within T5. It's not all just one thing. Some centers are more intense than others. And on the left side, there's this SZ for special zones. I'll touch on that later, but focusing on the transect, in the special zones, just, they're like special districts when we were talking in the comp plan, industry, theme parks, and so forth. But for the transect, these zones T1 through T6, even with their splits, they all relate to each other based on intensity. And so it's a ramp from the lowest in T1 to the highest in T6.3. So if we rearrange that in order, this is how it works out. The zones are really a straightforward progression in intensity within the zones, such as T3.1 to T3.2 to T3.3, but also between zones, such as T3.3 to T4.1 or T4.3 to T5.1. The directly adjacent zones are compatible, but if you start jumping big steps, then there's clearly going to be a concern for compatibility of development. And so while for the most part, this transect proceeds in a linear fashion like the prior slide, it's not always applied exactly that way. So for instance, zones T3.1, T4.1, and T5.1, these lower intensity of each, are intended for more rural conditions like this one in Tangerine. You may use those in the urbanized areas, but when you get to more rural areas, you don't apply the more intense zones. So there's a correlation there, and that happens at the comp plan level. But really, it's much about transitions. So here's an example of sections of the code that are aimed at reducing the intensity of development, when a zone is skipped or when you're adjacent to lower intensity development. The transition standards here exist both on the subdivision side and in zoning. So subdivision really deals with new development, and it ensures that new development doesn't create new incompatibilities by putting really intense new things next to existing places. So we require larger scale areas when they're being redeveloped, these greenfield areas or infilling a shopping center or whatnot, to step down in zones towards the existing lower intensity properties. So you start ticking down the numbers, from say here, T4.3, you start ticking down to that 3.2, and you know that it's going to be compatible when the numbers are pretty close to each other. And then in zoning on the right, the transitions reduce the allowable building envelope on the higher intensity properties if they're directly adjacent to lower intensity properties, right? Because if we're just translating zones, there are going to be some adjacencies that don't exactly work out in that nice smooth transition. Going forward, then we use zoning to sort of manage that transition. But as development occurs and the sort of growth on these corridors, then the subdivision gives us a greater control of that compatibility from zone to zone. So this is an example of the zone summary pages. These are sort of the pages of zoning in the code document. Here at the start of Article 3. So each zone has a page like this. These are 3 of them, the T3.2, T4.2, and T5.2. So you can see what a T3 looks like, what a T4 looks like, and what a T5 looks like in comparison to each other. So this page provides most of the basic standards for regulating building size. That's height, building setbacks, and lot coverage, how much of the property can be covered by buildings. And each of these is illustrated to demonstrate expectations for neighbors and developers alike. Now, the illustrations here, they don't direct architecture, but rather they demonstrate a range of building configurations that are anticipated outcomes of this zoning designation. The goal is for greater clarity of expectations, to reduce conflicts. So a closer look at the text within these tables, this sets forth standards like the minimum lot size and the maximum amount of the property that can be covered by buildings, the minimum and maximum setbacks. We have some maximum setbacks, especially in T5, where it's a problem if buildings are too far from the street, which is very different from, say, the suburban conditions in T3, where you want to push buildings back a minimum amount. In T5, you just want a maximum amount. And then, of course, maximum building height. But on the right, there's this section on frontage elements. So another wonky term, right? I think that's the only other really wonky term that you're going to have today. And the frontage is the space between buildings and the sidewalk, what we call how the building meets the street. And here we list a frontage yard on top and major frontage encroachments. I'll explain that. And before we look at the other zones specifically, these pages, we'll look at frontages and the standards that are used and then come back to the zones, because frontage is pretty important. It's sort of that other wonky thing that we're using in the code. So last time we discussed how buildings along Central would be out of place if they're on Washington Street. And this has to do with the height of the buildings, how far the buildings are set back from the sidewalk, and of course their use. But the bulk of the buildings is really makes the biggest difference. It also has to do with how large their front yard is, and is the front yard paved or is it landscaped? So the buildings on the left, they do have a front setback. So technically there is a front yard there, but their front yard is paved, so it's an extension of the sidewalk. You may have seating out there or bike racks and so forth. And frontage differences also have to do, here with the frequency of entries. Do you have a lot of entries along the street? Is that entry a shop, or is it residential? Is it raised above the sidewalk or not? All of these elements are part of frontage standards. And these frontage standards are critical to ensure compatibility between properties and coordinating the character of streets and the character of buildings and how they sit on their properties. And again, it's wonky, but hopefully hopefully we make it easy enough. So here's that situation in the prior image in code drawings. The top is a frontage yard in an urban condition. So that's shallow. The yard is that space between where the building's set back and the property line. It's shallow and paved, which would be appropriate on Central Ave. And in this case, the space may be used for outdoor seating, for merchandise display. There may be planting in raised beds and pots, but really, there shouldn't be grass just down at sidewalk level because that'll collect trash. At the bottom, there's a frontage yard in a more suburban condition, and this is moderately deep and it's landscaped, and that's really much more appropriate from Washington Street. However, note on the bottom image that the properties illustrated here are narrower than what are on Washington, right? So this bottom one shows T3.3, and Washington would be less intense. So for comparison, this is what properties in T3.2 would look like. These have, they're a larger width, there's deeper setbacks, and this would actually be much more appropriate on Washington than the T3.3. But the frontage is the same. It's a moderate to deep setback, and it's mostly landscaped. And we might just call that a front yard instead of a frontage yard, but we call it a frontage because it also applies to the side yards if you're on a corner property. Really anywhere that there's a sidewalk and a street, essentially the code is concerned with how the private development interfaces with the sidewalk and the street. So here's a code table that aligns the frontage yard condition. Those are the ones going up and down, least intense at the top to most intense at the bottom. And it aligns them with the transect zones, least intense to the left and most intense to the right. So the blue squares here that are filled in, those indicate that a frontage yard condition is permitted. So as the transect goes from lower intensity in T2, the frontage yards are also lower intensity, generally landscaped. And where the transect zone is higher intensity towards T6, the frontage yards are also higher in intensity and they're generally paved. And so I put that black dashed line to show this relationship. It's kind of like a trend line in a spreadsheet. There's a clear correlation between the intensity of the frontage yard. Is it landscaped at low intensity, landscaped and big at a low intensity level, or paved and small at a high intensity level? And that's correlated with the zoning. So here's a few other situations. We're not going to detail every one, just to really get an understanding of these frontage yards and this frontage condition. So on top here's a frontage yard that's fenced, and the bottom one is a shared courtyard. In this case, on the bottom, there's a few houses that face onto a court rather than directly under a sidewalk. And this is known as a cottage court. So this is, a type of way that properties are developed. And each of these types includes landscape requirements, and those are in the landscape section. And those requirements consider the depth and setback and the intensity of use when determining the sizing and requirements of landscape elements. Like, should you have large trees or medium trees or understory trees? For instance, that really depends on the yard size. And from a more urban and intense standpoint, there are also types of forecourts. For example, here, these are little paved yard areas along the sidewalk. And it's important that these aren't too large or too small, and that they can be active. On the top is a forecourt that's principally for outdoor seating, gathering, or events. This is a pedestrian centric forecourt. And at the bottom is one used for drop-offs, vehicular centric. So here's a pedestrian forecourt in downtown by the Church Street Sunrail station. I've had coffee on the bottom of this image plenty times. These are normal elements in cities, but the older codes, the use-based codes, they were really designed to build miles and miles of car-centric suburban areas. And they didn't include this type of terminology. So as a result, we have a bit of a public learning curve to reintroduce these elements. But they're common elements that we can find around town and point out and say, hey, that's what we mean. Here's a forecourt. This is a pedestrian forecourt right there, and it's active and useful. So here's a few other things that we're concerned about at frontages. Remember, frontages along the sidewalks. On top, drive-throughs. It's okay to have a drive-through, but a drive-through should not be along a sidewalk. On the bottom, we illustrate that you really need to provide fencing in more intense urban conditions that's near the sidewalk to clearly define where parking, trash for businesses and other business-related functions, or multifamily, other apartment-related functions that are private to the property should occur, and prevent them from happening or spilling over onto the sidewalk. And within frontages, we're really focused. The whole area of focus is the experience of people walking and rolling, so that really many aspects of compatibility, we're controlling those because they're experienced from the street. So here's a drive-through that's not on the street side, but rather interior to a property. It's a little more difficult to find good examples, but there are drive-throughs that meet these standards. This one, you enter from the side street behind the building, and you go around the building, and you come out on the main street. And there's not an aisle along the sidewalk. Rather, the sidewalk, you have windows where if you're walking there, you can see into the business. And here's a condition that we're trying to avoid. I doubt that too many people have walked here. Some people may have been forced to. And for those who have, it probably wasn't a very pleasant experience. So this is why we don't want, the drive-through aisles next to the sidewalk. You can have drive-throughs, just put the aisles in the right place. So this isn't really anything super new or revolutionary, and this has been core to form-based coding for decades, frontages. So here's an image of Horizon West to demonstrate where frontage standards would be applied. In this case, the solid lines are where we would apply the frontage requirements that we call a primary frontage. And this is really where your address is located, on the street that you're along. And these are the most stringent in ensuring buildings have a similar setback, similar heights, similar yard treatments, not the same, but similar, compatible. And the dashed lines are the secondary frontage. These are side streets on corner properties. And here we were concerned about supporting the pedestrians, but the rules that apply to buildings are much less stringent. So one element of frontage standards that you may have heard about in form-based codes is a focus on residential garages. While there's not a lot changing in the single-family zones, the garage conditions are a focus in those zones. And really conditions where the front of the house is basically all garage is the culprit. If you build properties that are narrow, you need an alley. Wide lots, they can still have front driveways, totally fine, provided that the garage is well located. So the example here, it's not the homeowner's fault, there's no blame, it's really the development pattern. We want to avoid development patterns that make the front of the house all car and not people. So the minimum way to correct that type of condition is by ensuring that, a habitable portion of the house where people are active, a living room, a porch, or other active space extends to be closer to the sidewalk than the garage is. Here, the human inhabitants are emphasized, not the vehicles. The prior image had properties too narrow to achieve this, and here we see about half of the front of the house is given to the garage. And that's about the most you can do and still emphasize the human entry and the activity of the home. When properties are wider, the garage can easily be further de-emphasized using the same strategy. It's not much, you're just pushing it back a little bit. Here, the garage occupies about 35–40% of the width of the house. But the house on the right, you see there's a driveway next to it going back. That demonstrates another condition where the garage is in the rear, accessed by a driveway. This is exactly how most parking is managed in all the historic neighborhoods around town. And at this property size, you don't need an alley. They're not needed everywhere, but they are in some conditions. So I showed these townhomes last time talking about density. Just imagine if these all had garages on the street. You basically would have a solid set of driveways across the entire sidewalk. And the sidewalk has to be slanted. There's all sorts of problems that come up that way. So you can't build townhouses with front garages. It just doesn't work. So narrow properties, they need an alley. So we do control the location of garages in new construction. And don't worry if your home's already built, you're fine. But new homes have garage location standards. On the left are conditions where the garage is accessed from the street, for general options. And on the right are preferred conditions if your garage is can be accessed from an alley or the side. So if there's an alley, the garage should be accessed from the alley. If you're on a corner lot, it should be accessed from the side street. But if you don't have an alley and you're not on a corner lot, then it's from the front. There's just some minimum rules here. And it's all really about giving preference to the humans along the sidewalk rather than cars and making the experience of using a sidewalk pleasant. So one more frontage consideration is fence height. This is always in zoning. And where fencing is built, where it's along the sidewalk, fencing needs to be relatively low and relatively transparent. But fencing in the backyard or along a shared side property line should be allowed to be taller and more solid for privacy. Here's another condition like that. And this is lower intensity, but as you get towards T5, fencing should be more durable, masonry or metal. But when you're towards T3, it may be wood or something simulating wood, a lighter material. And those sorts of things are managed, the how solid, how durable, and how tall based on location and transect zone. So we're also concerned with how much of the front property line has buildings along it. Well, anyhow, in the urban conditions. And I think I mentioned this last time and do want to reemphasize that as the goal for not continuing to grow out into rural lands and to protect existing neighborhoods means, densification of some corridors, these major corridors and shopping centers, then we're really concerned about form. If you're just talking, purely single family neighborhoods, there are elements of form that are less important. But when we're talking about corridors and multifamily and mixed use and townhomes, then it's very important. So here's something that we call frontage occupation. How much of the building, how much of that lot line, that front lot line has buildings along it. And this requires that buildings are built up to sort of line up along the front property line. So it's become common across the country, in these, even in these retail environments, and even chain retailers now, the chains are getting used to it. But in this case, we see buildings that are both lined up along the front property line and built close to the street with all of the parking behind. That's one setting. And I'll show another in a second, but just to compare to the current situation, without the standard along the frontage, buildings may be built along the front property line. They may be perpendicular with gaps of parking in between. They may be built in some other way, like on the bottom. And this really makes the sidewalk an unpleasant place, this sort of randomness. And here the issue isn't so much the little bits of parking in front, it's really that hodgepodge. So the buildings along a frontage with parking in front a building with parking on the side, some closer to the street, some further. On some roadways, we'll want to bring the buildings straight up to the street, like in the prior example, where there's future premium transit service, especially. But on others, the appropriate context for buildings along major roadways is to set back with some parking in front. And these suburban corridors are being identified in the comprehensive plan, and the opportunity to meet the street with some parking up front will be allowed. However, the extent of that parking is limited to situations like the one that's shown here, recently built. The buildings are lined up along the frontage. They're not perpendicular to it. They're along the sidewalk that we want activity on. But it recognizes the reality here that sites like this on major roadways, the design response has to adjust to the outcomes. What we want is greater uniformity of frontage, not architectural design, but of how far buildings are from that sidewalk and how much has buildings along it, rather than being a hodgepodge of all sorts of different conditions. So doing it this way avoids sort of excessively large parking areas or this mix of all sorts of conditions. And this sort of addresses the context of the street and creates greater clarity between sites. Now we deal with this sort of frontage build out most specifically in, say, a downtown context or a main street context, where you're really up to the street and you need to have a lot of activity on that street. But it's also important in these more suburban conditions where we just don't want this sort of randomness and lots of access points and driveways and so forth. And so to the final element of frontage is the encroachment. And here is, the encroachment is something that's allowed to project forward from the minimum setback. So we have a front setback, and things are then permitted to encroach forward of that. These are used with frontages to encourage buildings to have porches and stoops and galleries and awnings in urban conditions. It doesn't require these elements, but it encourages them by allowing them to encroach beyond the setback. So here on the top, we see a porch encroachment, and on the bottom is a terrace. These elements have some minimum requirements, but none of them are stylistic. Instead, they're really designed to encourage usable spaces at building entries, really in order to encourage activity on the sidewalk. So back to the zones themselves, these are the T2 zones, T2.1 through T2.3. You won't really notice here much of visual difference because T2, the properties are so large they don't even fit on a page, trying to keep a constant scale. So we've got these squiggly lines, here that show that the properties are much larger than the image. And in T2, all the setbacks are fairly large, and the buildings occupy, a very small portion of the property. But in T3, we can start to see more clear differences. T3.1 includes, on the left, includes properties up to an acre, while 3.3 is more typical of the housing that we saw in Horizon West a few slides back. But they all share a commonality of being entirely residential, of having, moderate or deeper setbacks that are landscaped, and all of buildings that are up to 2.5 stories. If we zoom into the illustrations for a moment, we also key these standards. On the left is a portion of that table that I showed earlier. On the right is that illustration, and the table's keyed in to the illustration for the setback standards and lot size standards for easy reference. And we demonstrate a few different conditions to the left of those standards. The sort of illustrations is just showing that you may have stoops and porches or terraces. Just in general, that there's variation. Now, the lightly shaded area here represents the required setbacks, how far the building has to be back from any of the property lines. And while the white area demonstrates where you can build on a property, the amount of building on the lot is still limited. So in this case, only 30% of the total property could be built upon. In T4, we see many more building types represented. There's duplexes, there's small multifamily dwellings, there's cottage courts, and there's townhomes. In T4.3 on the right, there's also an allowance for some small non-residential uses, though very limited in their size. We call these live works in some case, or very small. We saw some examples of a small coffee shop that might fit into a T4 context. Now, T4 represents a significant opportunity here, though, to move the needle on housing affordability. And this is by introducing the opportunity to mix different types of buildings and to have a greater variety in say, smaller size units or more housing on a similar amount of land to share those costs. And these zones, they share a commonality of allowing a mix of housing types with relatively shallow setbacks, but the setbacks are generally landscaped. Now, Orlando's historic neighborhoods near downtown, they have some of this mix. They'd be somewhere in the T4.2, T4.1 condition. But you really don't find this in between those historic neighborhoods and newer developments. But newer developments that have been happening in the past, past few years have started to reintroduce this mix of townhomes and smaller single-family homes with larger ones. Now in T5, we see a generally urban character of buildings, and they occupy most of their property. They're located close to the sidewalk. T5, it doesn't require commercial, it doesn't require mixed use, but rather its intensity of building that's greater than the principally residential zones in T3 and T4. Multifamily buildings in T5 context, they also contribute significantly to the affordability goals. And in a context here for affordability, where residents are really more likely to have nearby access to goods and services and transit. So these zones in T5 all share commonality of allowing a broad mix of uses with very shallow setbacks, and those setbacks are generally paved. Interestingly, though, while the prior zones established a minimum front setback, I mentioned this, T4 and T3 have a minimum setback, T5 and T6 have a maximum setback. It's important that the buildings in these zones be located near the sidewalk. And in this set of zones here, you can start to see the building height more significantly increase. But there's a range to be able to fit in. Like in some cases, that T5.1, which is really only there at 2 stories, is the appropriate zone next to some existing housing. Yet in other places, this 3-story T5.2 is appropriate. In other cases, 5.3 at 5 stories is more appropriate. And then finally, T6, here the buildings are obviously much taller and much more intense. Like T5, this zone doesn't require mixed use, but it accommodates large buildings that may be a wide variety of mixed use, or purely residential office, purely residential, purely hotel, any mix of these things, but very intensive buildings. And that's what's most important about this zone is the intensity. It's not in a lot of places in the county, but there are some places where, like I drive, the goal is to really create essentially a new downtown for the county and a new center. And so these T6 zones, you can see they act like the others, but they're much more intense. Now, I mentioned special zones before, and we won't get into these details on that zone, but I wanted to point them out. These are types of development in the county that don't fit into the Transect zones that we've looked at. So each of these has a set of separate standards as well as more specific considerations with their adjacency. And that leads me to buffers. Now, in general, the use of Transect alleviates the need to provide buffers between properties. Mostly they're wastes of space. However, there are buffer requirements for special zones, as well as where there's a significant difference from in Transect zone, like from T6 to T3. And the table here in the landscape section establishes buffers based on the adjacent zones. So there's greater buffers where there's a greater disparity in the intensity or the special use like heavy industrial from any other mixed or residential uses. But otherwise, buffering is sort of negated by the Transect. And so that's about it concerning the application of the Transect to zoning. And there are a few other standards here and there, of course, but not too many in the code. And so how is this accomplished? Initially zoning will be modified by translating existing zones into the Transect zone that most closely aligns with their existing standards. So here's the current version of that chart. And further, the comprehensive plan's place types will specify which Transect zones are appropriate. In that case, if someone requests to be rezoned, the place type is consulted to determine if the proposed zone is appropriate, along with understanding that zone transition standards that you shouldn't jump up because of the impact that it has on the neighbors. And this is really a much clearer and more predictable process, which we hope will provide, greater confidence. And we're in the process here of aligning and testing the correlation between place types and transect zones. An initial correlation looks like this, where each place type corresponds to a limiting set of appropriate zones, along with transition standards. And there's also rural types that do this, but we wanted to show, these urban types first as they're the most impactful. And so that was a lot, and the latter half of this meeting is going to be lighter than the first part. So, at least from the presentation standpoint, we'll pause now and take some questions before we talk more specifically about uses.
Thank you, Matt. And there are a couple of questions on uses, but I will hold them until you've covered that section. So for those who have posted questions, please know they will be answered. So I have a question for you before I go to these questions. And that is, someone had a question about the difference between intensity and density, and it was answered already. But why no FAR? Like, why do we not include FAR in the code? I think it's worth, I know it's not a predictor of height or of massing, but I think you should speak a little more about why it's excluded.
Well, I mean, it is in the comprehensive plan because it sort of has to be.
Yes.
So it's there, and we don't want to. We want to avoid as many complications and contradictions between the comprehensive plan and the zoning code as possible. But from the Transect standpoint, FAR and density are really not. They don't become relevant if you are looking at the size of a property, the setbacks, the building height that's allowed, and the amount of the property that can be covered. All of those things create a volume. And what you stick in that volume is going to be compatible with other buildings of a similar volume. If you have a 5-story building that's 80 feet deep and 100 feet wide, it's going to be compatible with a similar building. Now, there's other things that further limit your ability to develop, especially, non-residential use, which is parking. Can you park it? That always becomes, a core issue. So you may have, a 5-acre site, but you can't cover that 5 acres in buildings. There's other things that control the amount of intensity. But from a compatibility standpoint, which is where we're laser focused, we want to control the bulk of buildings so that they are compatible with each other. And the comprehensive plan has controls for density and FAR. And so we want to get those as aligned as possible, but we don't want to duplicate those controls in the zoning code.
That's good. Okay, so there's another question here, which is an interesting one and an important one. Does this improve solar access?
It doesn't really change solar access necessarily. And what I've, we've gotten this question in a lot of cases. Well, I guess you could say
there are
it,
a couple
does,
of
it does,
things
it does, it does, yeah, it does and it doesn't. It does in a way of not being blocked out by development that's out of scale. So if you, in the case where you have a lower building like a 2-story single-family home, and you want rooftop PV, and you're being shaded by a 5-story building, we sort of mitigate those circumstances. In terms of orienting blocks and so forth, most of that solar access can be managed by the roof form of new development. And with increasing net zero standards, what we're finding, working in places where it's required, like California and Oregon, or where it's a concern but not totally required yet in Colorado, we find that the code says, like this one town that we're working on in Colorado, the code says your blocks need to be north-south. Well, our blocks are angled to get this beautiful view of the mountains. Well, it turns out that actually is more advantageous from a solar standpoint. We've looked at it, and the solar companies say, yeah, that's the way that you should orient your roofs. But if you're in a different orientation, it's a different roof form question more so than a sort of principal orientation of the lot. But Marina, you might have some other points.
Well,
to add
yeah,
to that.
That's the only thing I wanted to add to what you said. There are open space requirements. that's one thing in the code. But the other thing is that based on the orientation, there are solar protection strategies being provided or offered. So, you know, if you're west facing, it's one set of strategies. If you're north facing, it's a whole other set of strategies. And, you know, the encouragement of planting trees along sidewalks is another one in which you can really help minimize the solar impact on buildings. So it is baked into the code in many different layers. But what it doesn't do is, and you know, we're working in Australia right now where there's a absolute requirement for solar access, and it can be a hindrance to the you know, everybody has the right to a patio there, and where we're working, and that really does dictate the placement of the building on the lot, whereas we believe that there are other ways in which to achieve that. So we're not being as rigorous about it.
Well, and you know,
So
the net zero standards are sort of better ways of achieving that, you know, because now, you know, if you have, say, a net zero requirement, now the development community has to figure out how to meet that, and that may be by orienting their lots in a certain manner. But you know, you have wetlands, you may have certain considerations that you then need to change the roof form.
That's right. So the next question I'm going to direct to Alberto. It's I see that Olin is furiously writing some responses away. But Alberto, while Olin's doing this, I want to direct a few questions to you, and I'm going to try summarize them in one sort of in one series of questions. You know, every jurisdiction has its own code, and Orlando's is different to Orange County. So how do you ensure compatibility where there is where they share a line, a jurisdictional line, essentially? Maybe Alberto's no longer there. Well, they're required to, then I'm going to answer on their behalf. They are required to coordinate with adjacent jurisdiction, and they are doing that. And especially when at the bigger level, when they're looking at sectors and place types that have been defined and how and where those are mapped for. Oh, there's Alberto.
Yeah, so Marina, I'm sorry. I had a technical problem with my computer. For some reason, it just kicked me out.
That's all right. That's all right. I don't know if you even heard the question.
I didn't, but I as you started answering, I heard your response. Does it have to do with
how do you coordinate across jurisdictional lines to ensure that there's some compatibility of zoning when Orange County is right up against, you know, Osceola County, as an example?
So we have initiatives that are at a regional level. For example, the housing affordability crisis. We joint venture with Seminole County, with Osceola County, as well as very in detail coordination with the city of Orlando. And we continue to look at it, to look at specific conditions and to how to address the challenges from a regional perspective. So from that end, we do coordinate. It's just very critical and responsible to do so. However, for compatibility related concerns within the 13 municipalities of Orange County, we continue to look at joint planning agreements for those jurisdictions that have joint planning agreements with Orange County for the purpose of annexations as well, so that we have a cohesive and much more predictable way of infill and redevelopment within those specific areas, so that there is continuity as well as the character of those places. We also have interlocal agreements that we develop every so often for corridors and specific areas with those municipalities as well, to be able to continue to coordinate growth. And hopefully with the new code, with Orange Code, as well as Vision 2050, as we continue to understand the new application of future land uses, we want to be able to engage those municipalities that are very interested in following our process very closely, to continue to coordinate as well. Hopefully that addresses some of the questions.
Yeah, thank you, Alberto. I'm going to I'm going to combine two questions I see here, which both are important. And I'm going to say something about it before I ask Matt to answer it. So the first one says, I see little vision for redevelopment. And I would tell that person that they need to go back and look at the previous presentations in which we really spoke about how the vision and the character areas of the different market areas are baked into the comprehensive plan that talks about where we want, which areas we want to preserve, which areas we want to see intensify, and at what degree of intensification, where is redevelopment appropriate and where is redevelopment not appropriate. So that has been tackled in the previous presentations. So we'd encourage you to look at that. Now, the next question is somewhat tied to this, Matt. A lot of this sounds very subjective. How can a developer know what is predictable? I want to say something about it too, but I want you to tackle it first, and then you may say what I have to say.
Oh, you want me to say it first? Well, so
Well.
you can write codes completely objectively. You can write codes completely subjectively, and let me tell you, from our standpoint, many of our clients are developers. Many of them are municipalities. So we understand sort of both sides of the coin. And I think that we've tried, our hardest to put in as much objectivity into the code as possible because we want to streamline the process. We understand that the process is just as much of a burden in many cases as what's allowed or not allowed. For one of the big process areas is that coordination between the comprehensive plan and the zoning code. And, we're working clearly to address that, but also in finding ways to make it easier for the development community to understand exactly what is going to be allowed in a given location, but also the public to better understand what exactly the code is allowing in a given location. So our standards for subdivisions, for example, which we'll talk more about in the next set of meetings, those are objective, heavily objective, with some exceptions for conditions like wetlands and so forth that you have to, you may have to make some subjective rule on. And we try to be as clear as possible where there's subjectivity and limit that subjectivity, and that gives the county staff the ability to process most of the application requirements. And that goal has both been on a process standpoint, but also from knowing that the goal of writing a code from a form-based standpoint is not only about the built outcome, it's about understanding have a better understanding between the public, the neighbors, and the development community, so that what to expect coming out of the code. So I think most of the standards are very much objective.
Yeah, I think the only thing I want to add to what you're saying is that there's Matt showed in the presentation how the current standards right now, as they're written, do not in any way predict form. So, it doesn't tell you where a setback line needs to be. It gives you an FAR, but if you concentrate it in the middle of the property, you can go taller. If you're a thinner floor plan, you can go taller. If you're thicker, you can go lower. So it's not a predictor of form at all. And the reason this is, so how can a developer know this is predictable, I think also goes to process, in the sense that when you think about more often than not, when community members come and speak out against a project, why are they speaking against it? Because they find it's non-contextual, because they think that the transitions are not appropriate, because they think there's a compatibility issue between what's existing there and what isn't. And so the transects that have been proposed are, and the amount of attention that has to be paid to the frontage, which is how the buildings meet the street and what the space between the buildings look like, is intended to help mitigate that. And I think that will help tremendously with the predictability. And one other thing about the redevelopment, I also want to say that what this code is intended to do is to encourage a lot of building types that we haven't seen recently in Orange County, because you see them in the PDs, but you don't see them in Orange County in the regular zoning, because for whatever reason, the density isn't completely aligned with the kind of building type people want to do, so they don't get built. So what this code has done is right-sized it, in the sense that we are identifying where townhouses are appropriate or not. We're identifying where duplexes are appropriate or not. And because density is tied at the level of the comprehensive plan and not into the code, it makes these building types more possible. We're allowing smaller lot sizes, greater lot sizes. So, Orange County has 70 meters, 70 feet, 80-foot lot differences. And they actually are in different categories. But if you look at the setbacks and the height and the FAR, they're exactly the same. On the street, you really can't tell the difference between a 70-foot lot or an 80-foot lot. So we want to maintain that consistency, yet we want to also be able to afford the opportunity to gently densify where that's appropriate. So all that helps not only increase the range of options, but layer on a level of predictability as well.
And not to increase our response, but I think it is important to point out that the process as of the last decades has been to pursue development through PDs, and that is a long and very subjective process. And what we're putting in place are standards that are objective for, let's say 90% of what you would be negotiating from a PD standpoint, so that all of that is very clear, and it gets us to the important questions. What's subjective are the things that need to be subjective, and what's objective is everything else.
That's right. And so I just see a question that says, will the code be able to significantly promote infill? I hope that you've just heard from my answer that it is yes, by all those techniques that we just spoke about. So there's another quick and easy question. Someone asked, is there a table we can use to see how existing zoning is being converted to new Transect zones? And can we obtain a copy of the presentation? And yes, this copy of the presentation will be made available. The table to convert existing zoning to the new Transect zones. Of course, everybody wants to know, what is R1A becoming? Is it T21? Is it T22? What is it? So there will eventually be a map. That map is still being worked on, but that will be made available. We just don't want to show a zoning map now, first because it's a work in progress, but we wanted to explain the framework and the Transect zones so that people could understand the character that each of these zones is intended to promote before everybody just zeroes in on, well, what is my property becoming? But residents or property owners should be assured that the Transect zones have been very carefully calibrated to the existing development capacity that a property has. So we're not starting from scratch. We've really just tweaked the numbers where we felt they needed to be tweaked in terms of the zoning and the development potential of a property. Anything else you want to add to that, Matt?
Well, just that the draft translation was like 2 slides ago.
Yes, we did see it, but it was we just had one slide on it, and it's I'm sure people have a lot of questions about it later, but it will be made available. And tiny housing will of course be allowed and encouraged to develop on certain zones, not others. So that's part of where infill is appropriate versus where it's not. Where are ADUs appropriate? Where are they not? I think the other questions have to do with, I'm cognizant of time, have to do with uses. I'm going to throw one more question at you, Matt, and then we'll reserve the rest for afterwards. Which could be Matt or Alberto. What about housing areas developed near landfills? Would this be stopped with the new code? I think that's the comprehensive plan, not the new zoning necessarily.
Yeah, that's the comprehensive plan. So, and I think a lot of that is in the special districts in the comprehensive plan, right?
That's right. So I think the rest I'm going to, well, there's one more, and I think it's also a very overarching question, but I'm going to throw it to you anyways, Matt. Does this code address in any specific way how development should be resilient to natural or man-made disasters and sustainable environmentally, economically, and socially? I think that's the overlaying of the code and the comprehensive plan. Some things are, yeah.
I think you can address that, Marina.
Yeah, well, some things are relevant at the level of the comprehensive plan, right? In terms of what are the natural areas that are being preserved? How are we enhancing your natural systems and your environmental systems to make sure that they're not intruded upon? And then in terms of buildings that are environmentally or economically and socially resilient, well, environmentally, yes, there are ways in which to make buildings green. But before you think about making buildings green, which is very important, you want to think about making the neighborhood or the development green. And we have all sorts of regulations in the code that encourage that. everything from increasing transit options to make people get out of their car and walk, and making sure that those walks are convenient and comfortable and shaded. Everything from, so that has to do with how the buildings meet the street and making sure that the streets are pedestrian friendly and all of that. Socially, to be made more socially resilient really means not having one building type on one zone, Transect zone and or building type in too large an area. And Matt talked about that very much in the previous series, which talked about how you want to encourage communities to become more complete. That means a mix of uses. That means a certain mix of building types within a certain geographic area, so that people can be within walking distance or biking distance of the majority of their daily needs. So that greater introduction and integration of uses is what will encourage people to be outdoors. The addition of porches on a house encourages people to be outdoors. So all these little elements, some of them are built into the code, some of them are built into the comprehensive plan, but it's all intended to encourage more connectedness between people. And we know that once people satisfy their daily needs in terms of housing and shelter and all of that and food, being socially connected is very important. And the way in which we occupy the land and the way in which we use the land is a very key component of that, to encourage social connectedness at a greater, with a greater degree of intensity.
Well, I'll transition with one point on the subject matter, which is that there's a lot of energy embodied in existing buildings, and one of the issues that you run into quite frequently is the inability to easily change use of existing buildings without redevelopment, and that's when we get into use consolidation. So in uses, moving out of the use question, and we could probably answer more specifics on that on the other sustainability questions at the end. But the Orange Code significantly consolidates existing uses. Now, in the last presentation, we discussed how use is not necessarily a good predictor of compatibility. When we use form as our primary means of achieving compatibility, we can simplify uses. Now, current zoning has little concern with the form of buildings, rather the use and density or amount of commercial building that's allowed to be built. Those are the primary ways the development's regulated. We just sort of discussed some of that in the questions about what happens at the comprehensive plan and zoning. And there are some elements of form that are regulated in existing zoning, like setbacks and building height, but more so as an afterthought than upfront, which is use. Right now, use is regulated above all else. Form-based code instead begins with the form of the building first, ensuring that building setbacks and heights are similar, and that there are frequent entries along the sidewalks. And use and density are there as secondary, and the use can vary greatly along with the density, which can vary greatly but still fit in the same building envelope. So we discussed this in the last meeting, and you've seen elements of form and how different uses can coexist. Let's take this image and see what it really looks like. Here's the same block in Baldwin Park from that last slide, and on this block there are 17 businesses, and those are currently categorized into 13 different uses. At present, an attorney's office and a bookkeeper, they're not only different uses, they're different categories of use. Legal services versus engineering and management services as the primary categories. The categories above the specific use of attorneys, services, and offices versus accounting, auditing, and bookkeeping. Some differences are important, like eating and drinking as a category that's important to differentiate, principally because they do actually require more parking than, say, a barbershop. But here on this block, these 17 businesses don't really need to be categorized as 13 different uses within 8 different primary categories. They really exist in the same form of the building, and those uses are going to change over time. So here's the consolidation of uses for this block. Same block, same 17 businesses, but they're categorized as 4 different uses: retail, office, food and beverage, and then big box retail. So that's 9 fewer categories, in this one block. And all 3 are under the same primary category of commercial. Now, big box retail here is its own category because the size can cause compatibility issues and additional considerations that we may need, like dealing with shopping carts. And if there was a small grocer, though, in one of those main street shops, just the same size as anything else, and it wasn't a big box, it really wouldn't need special considerations above just being a commercial retail establishment. So here, as you can see, all these uses are perfectly compatible. And as a result, Orange Code really doesn't need to further restrict those uses. Last time we spoke about how coffee shops can inhabit many forms, and that the form of the building and the size is more of a critical indicator of compatibility. And even some odd combinations like this, like cats and coffee, work just fine if they're in the right context of the building form. And especially that in more urban conditions, that the specific use isn't really that critical, especially given that uses change within buildings pretty frequently. We don't want to see a heavy industrial use here, of course, and that's perfectly rational to exclude. But this coffee shop in downtown, it could be a clothing store. Changing, that's no big deal. It could be a barber, it could be a nail salon, it could be a sandwich shop, it could be an architect's office, it could be a bar. Because of the intensity of this area overall in the form of the building, all of these uses could easily occupy the same space. And as a result, being too specific about use just complicates things. So here's what the overall transition looks like. I think it actually loaded this time. This one sometimes takes a minute to load. So thankfully, there's some software, we use Xmind, that makes it easy to track this sort of use consolidation. I mean, sort of easy. But in any case, the scope of consolidation here should be clear. On the right is the full consolidation, and we zoom in further to see all the separate uses and how they find themselves into shorter, clearer, more rational categories. So in practice, really, most of these uses don't need to be separately regulated. And many of the concerns that may have led to separately being listed at some point are already covered by the building code, by health codes, by the fire code, by other ordinances. A lot of that stuff is already covered elsewhere. We don't need to repeat it in zoning. And, I don't want to brush over it. We also can't discuss every use because there's so many, but rather the approach and the compatibility goals. So here's the existing category of engineering and management services as a category. A very simple example. There's 7 uses in this category. All of these uses are now considered offices that are within the commercial category. So commercial subcategory office. To us, there's really no difference between architectural services, public relations services, and business consulting. Why do they need to be different uses? If they fit into the building size allowed, then they can be in T5 or T6, no problem. The issue of compatibility has to do with any of the uses being, really in a big building versus a small building. That's what creates compatibility issues, or, too much parking for the neighborhood. Well, that's managed by the zones, and it's managed by form standards, and those determine where big buildings can be located, rather than where each of these uses can be located, because many different uses can be in a big building and many different uses can be in a small building. So here's those same uses in the current table. This is the current zoning code, its use table, and each individually here is individually identified, yet the only difference is, so on the left is the uses, on the right is where they're permitted. And the only difference in how they're currently applied, how each of those uses is permitted or not permitted, is that engineering and architectural services here are not allowed in the NC zone, while architectural services are allowed in the NC zone. But then those engineering and architectural services are allowed in the NR zone, and others are excluded. It's just crazy. It doesn't make sense. It's unnecessary. So these uses are already essentially, all allowed in the same way. All these can be office. They're all allowed in the same way. So we consolidate this information and simplify the code from a legibility standpoint. And from an administration standpoint and enforcement standpoint, it's also simpler. And also from an application standpoint, making it easier for people who are developing or running these businesses. So here's what the existing use table looks like. Here's every page of it. That prior page, just repeat it like 25 or 26 times. For those who are old enough to remember, it reminds me of when Windows, old versions of Windows had that error that would just cascade. Anyhow, so here's the new use table. At the top the transect zones, just like you have in any other code category. And these are, the T3, T4, T5, like we've explained, and then you can see the 1, 2, 3 under those. So those relate to what we talked about in the first half. Here you can see that in T5 and T6, most uses are allowed, except for industrial uses and agricultural uses. And so it should be an easier system to understand, an easier one to apply, and an easier one to enforce. In the end, we end up with the primary categories being reduced down to 9. In Orange Code, there's some regulations that are tied to the primary category, like parking requirements. Parking requirements may be generally applied to all commercial uses, yet individual subcategories within that may be isolated for additional regulation. So parking for food and beverage and for office, for places of assembly, those need some specific regulations, but in general, other commercial uses don't, like a women's clothing retailer and a family clothing retailer and a pet food retailer, they don't really need different standards. And of course, uses aren't just about where they're allowed. There's always additional standards for specific conditions. So those all still exist. And we've sort of simplified these as much as possible and coordinated them with the transect zones, but the core of these standards really carry over from the current code. So here on the left are performance standards, that's noise, odor, and similar issues, those are still there. And on the right are supplemental regulations by use, and that includes issues like when a use is limited in size in certain zones, or when there's specific screening requirements, or restricting building materials being stored outside. All that sort of stuff makes it in, but we've simplified the use categories and as such simplified these other sets of regulations because there was a lot of repetition. And just again, the point of use consolidation is to simplify and to rely upon the form of buildings to determine compatibility ahead of other issues. Of course, with the exception of industrial uses. And with this approach, in general, we can better control the intensification of the commercial corridors within the targeted sector, which is where the sort of growth focus is located. Absorbing growth here reduces the amount of growth that will impact existing neighborhoods in rural and natural areas. And with the Transect, there's a means of managing compatibility and transitions of intensity. And by consolidating uses there, we can further streamline the process, to focus on growth issues that really matter. And Marina, I told you the second half was a lot shorter, and I can jump back to the use tables, but that's really covering the use consolidation. It's really about categorizing, simplifying, and focusing on issues that really matter to differentiate versus differentiating things that are really not important. And as we saw in the existing use table, they may not even be separately applied.
Yes, well, so I'm good. There was one question that someone posed initially, which is I found it to be a good one, and it's worth spending some time to talk about. I understand why one might want to regulate the density, height, bulk, and placement of structures due to the direct impact of these characteristics on nearby properties and public service provision cost. Why regulate use at all? If the single-family house next door was converted to a law office, as common along Robinson Street, east of downtown Orlando, the impact on the adjacent properties would be less than the impact if that same house was residential, same use, and had a family with multiple children who drive with people outdoors and being loud more often. Wouldn't it make sense that a Transect zone allow any use that was less intense than the normal variation of the same use would allow? So the potential nuisance would be a controlled variable instead of the use, which is a poor proxy. I think we're certainly trending in that direction tremendously, and we have simplified uses a lot. But that law office could impact parking, or could impact with the number of employees that come to that building. So maybe Matt, you could pull up the use table and maybe just zoom into an area so that people can see that there's way more uses as you increase in intensity. The uses get more and more permissive, and the form of the building is what will really control what uses are allowed. But we're trying to. The point is we are trying to to not control use if we don't have to.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting. The first part of that comment, before we got to the specific example, is really exactly what we're trying to do. So here's, the T5 column in general, and you can see in T5, for residential, we're allowing pretty much everything, lodging, commercial. What are the gaps in commercial? Adult entertainment, because that's specifically regulated, separately. There, gaming, gambling, that's also specifically regulated separately. But otherwise, there really aren't many gaps here in the table. Rural retail, well, that happens in T2, right? So there's a gap. And then when we get to industrial, there's some more gaps and so forth. Correctional facilities, there's a gap for that one. But we're doing exactly that in T5 and T6. We're doing that to an extent in T4, which T4 would more frequently allow the law office example. But there is an issue that comes up from that particular case, which is, well, parking, as Marina has pointed out, most of the time when you have a home converted to a law office, in the more intensive ones, there's a parking lot that's added, sort of behind the home, and then at nighttime, it's not actually utilized. So it can become incompatible when you're at the lower intensities. So like T3, we try to not mix much more than residential, except for maybe a bed and breakfast by special exception, or these sort of recreational or athletic clubs, which may be part of a development's clubhouse, for example, and that's allowed in T3.
Matt,
but
could
in
you
general,
talk a little bit about the home occupation too, the type A and the type B? Because I think an accountant would be permitted if it fits within a certain percentage of the footprint of the house.
Yeah, so the home occupation standards, the current draft that we have based on home occupation uses a model that we worked on, off of Portland's here, which it really separates the home occupations based on the sort of impact of people coming and going, and if you have any business merchandise or if you're displaying anything. So essentially, if you have a low impact home occupation, like you don't have customers and employees, or very, very, a certain number can come, but you don't have many that come, that means you're not impacting parking in the neighborhood. You're not storing materials outside. You can't have, large signage and all that sort of stuff. Those are a much easier permit to achieve. But then there's the type B home occupation, which has more sort of neighbor impact on the neighbors. You may have customers coming, limited in number, but still customers. You may have some signage. You may have some business vehicles, for example. And in that case, it really does require some neighborhood buy-in. But in the small case, it doesn't. So it is an example of meeting that. However, T4.3, you would totally be fine having the lawyer's office, not a problem. In T5 and T6, for sure, but in T3, it's much more of an issue.
Thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt you before. But I'm going to throw another use question to you that has to do with rural land uses. Currently, East Orlando is developed of rural land use and residential. How does that change the area if they currently have cows on the property? It doesn't. Well,
I mean, the goal is to hope that they keep the cows on the property.
That's right.
By encouraging infill. So we have these T2 zones, and T2 zones are designed for pastoral uses, agricultural uses, and then also the types of rural agricultural businesses that you have to support those areas. And this rural retail that I pointed out, I think the related standards there have to do with selling things that are produced on the property. Like you have a farm and you have a market out front, or you have a flower farm and you have a flower stand. Those sorts of things are permitted, But that's all in the T2, and the T2 is really not about development. It's in the rural service area, and the goals in the comprehensive plan are to really avoid growth in rural areas and to target the growth in the infill areas. So yeah, I mean, it wouldn't it shouldn't change much of anything. Should hopefully help preserve the character.
That's right, and especially yes, the comp plan will do that as well. So there's one question which someone is asking, if the ones, the 4, 1, 5, 1, 2, 1 R have to do with the rural, why not make it R instead of 1? And then the 2 would stand for something else. But there may be categories that have we don't that's just how the numbering system works. We think we're going to be adding to it every time. So while we're not married to T4 1 2 3, T5 1 2 3, it's sort of how we've gotten used to describing it. And if we begin with rural, we don't want to be getting into a letter designation that is characteristic of a use. So
well, I think, Marina, it's still, so the intensity system, the ones still fit perfectly in the intensity system, from least intense to most intense. I guess maybe I didn't explain well enough in rural areas where you have, say, something like that example in Tangerine, there was, the post office and, another business, and then the church, and then some housing on smaller lots, and then housing on bigger lots. Well, what we could do to enable that is, have in a rural place type, like a hamlet, for example, you could have T5.1. You could build T5.1 there, but you couldn't build T5.2. From a comprehensive plan standpoint, we would say in rural areas, T5.2 is not appropriate. And T5.1 may be appropriate within a village or a hamlet. So, but in the urban areas, we still have a use for those T4.1 and T5.1. So I may not have explained that as well as I could have.
No, yeah, it has to do with the nomenclature, really, essentially. So one question is here. I heard the answer to my questions about resiliency and sustainability. Will these terms be used in the final Orange Code? And I would say that they are not only in the Orange Code, but they are in the comprehensive plan as well. And what Matt has not described yet, but will probably when he speaks about the next sections of the code, is the very first chapter or article, which includes the goals that this code is intended to meet. And it's really important to have it as part of the intent of the code to remind plan reviewers, to remind applicants, what is the code intended to achieve from a sustainability standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, from a social connectedness standpoint, from all of that. And you will find that language to be very descriptive in terms of what the Orange Code is intended to, what the objectives and the goals of the Orange Code is. I don't know if you want to add to that, Matt.
Well, just that, we do want to, as best as possible, avoid overlap between the comprehensive plan and the zoning code. It's like each one needs, we want them to stay in their lane, because overlap means, coordination issues, interpretation issues, and so forth. And the sustainability goals are certainly much more specifically spelled out from a comprehensive plan standpoint than from a zoning code standpoint. Of course, they're in the intent, because that is the goal for it. But there are so many sort of indirect ways that that sustainability makes its way into using form-based coding, especially in in making infill viable and transit and all these other things. But those are really described. They may be described in the intent, but they're more so described in the comprehensive plan than the zoning code.
Well, the zoning code gets down to the level of the building, really, right? And the comprehensive plan gets down at the level of the building and the block. The comprehensive plan speaks to it at the level of the community and at the level of sort of region, county-wide growth. So
and county-wide natural systems and
all of that, absolutely. So would the same ordinances stand when it comes to group living homes? And I would say yes, because we haven't changed those standards much at all, partly because there are state regulations that have to be upheld. There are sometimes minimum distance requirements between group homes. but we didn't change those standards much at all.
But the community residential, I don't, I think you were, Marina, you were more focused on the initial use piece, and the community residential home was one of those. That was much, it's permitted in T5 and T6, but there's some of the same sorts of specific use considerations when applied in T4. So I can see, in T4.1 is a special exception with some additional standards. T4.2 and 3 permitted with some additional standards. T5 and 6 permitted.
That's right.
So I don't know how that overlaps with the, with the focus of the question.
I wonder if they mean co-housing versus group living homes versus, senior living facilities. I'm not sure. Maybe that person can clarify the question. But the reality is that there's no type of housing that is precluded, and we're really trying to get away from the ownership structure of that home. We're much more focused on the form of the home, with the understanding that there are certain state regulations, of course, they have to comply with. So Matt, there was one question about parking, and I'm only going to throw it to you in the context of maybe you can explain what the next session will speak about and how it relates to Transect zones, because it's a good question. It says, why not create parking maximums instead of minimums? And maybe you can talk to the different standards for the different Transect zones.
Yeah, and it's like, how many things can we get into all the detail of? So we're working through this. Right now in our parking, we've got this area A and area B, and we're going to be revising this to, because the comprehensive plan and zoning are sort of going along, and now we're going to be doing another revision here shortly to use the place types to define the sort of, what do we mean by area A and area B? So what we're getting at here is that from a parking standpoint, there are some areas that will become more walkable, and in those areas, the standards for parking should be lower. And there are areas that will remain similar to how they are today. And in those areas, the standards for parking should remain relatively similar. And so we're working this system of differentiation in those areas. Now we can tie it to the place types. When we did this draft, we couldn't. Now we can tie it to the place types and say, in a suburban, in a suburban neighborhood fabric, here's a standard, but in an urban center, there's a different standard. Right, and so that in the urban centers, in the transit corridors, in the more intense traditional neighborhood fabric, we can reduce parking and get towards that focus. Even potentially maximums. But in areas that are going to remain, auto-centric for the foreseeable future, we really can't do that, because that would cause all the issues that are the reasons that those standards are there in the first place. So we can optimize them, but we can't get so far to limiting them, but we can limit them in areas where walkability is a key outcome.
That's right. So the person clarified that they were referring to community residential homes in terms of where do they stand. And they said there are distance requirements in our areas are overwhelmed. And it's true, we have maintained distance requirements. We certainly haven't made them stricter. If anything, we loosen them up a little. But I do remember that we did maintain distance requirements. I just don't remember what that distance is. Maybe Olin or Alberto have something to add to this. But it'll be hard to remember what that is. Well, if they do, we'll go back to them. But I'm going to direct the next question to you, Alberto. What about zoning for Pine Hills Road that currently has POR1 and commercial uses? When will Pine Hills be rezoned? We started talks with planning staff 3 years ago during NID meetings about adopting the Pine Castle plan, but staff abruptly stopped.
Yeah, so two different areas. Pine Castle has undergone quite a bit of a planning process, a visioning process, public outreach and engagement process in which the residents participated, and a vision plan was put together. In that sense, it carried new nomenclature for future land uses in a station area. One of the two that are in unincorporated Orange County as it relates to Sunrail. That process of Pine Castle as a district, over 500 plus acres of an area, has already been transmitted by the Board of County Commissioners, and the local planning agency has also reviewed and recommended adoption for that particular district. However, the abrupt halt of that process, as the individual that asked the question is referring to, had to do with the school concurrency, the school capacity, as we continue to coordinate with Orange County Public Schools to formalize a process for a district-wide area that is going to be an administrative rezoning for that large of an area. So we have to identify the total potential development of the development capacity of the units, how many school kids would be generated by that scenario, and how many schools would be needed in order to address the school and educational need for that particular development. So we are in the process of a follow-up with the school board to be able to formalize that process in terms of when would this take place and move forward. We are finalizing the public outreach and public engagement effort of Vision 2050 and Orange Code. And rather than us bring to the board a standalone district, since the Pine Castle is also form-based and it has a very consistent visioning structure in terms of the future land uses that are now embedded in Vision 2050, we think we're going to bundle the effort and carry it as part of Vision 2050 adoption or the reorg of the comprehensive plan towards the beginning of 2022, and as well as the administrative rezoning area of the Pine Castle will also take place during Orange Code adoption. So we think that's going to be a much more straightforward process than move forward with Pine Castle alone. As it relates to Pine Hills and Silver Star as a corridor, we are currently planning for a small area study for that particular corridor, which will take place July 26th through July 28th. And that will look at the existing future land uses of the abutting land uses of the corridor, as well as the existing zoning districts, and identify potential rezoning categories for that particular corridor. So those of you that are interested, please stay tuned and get involved with us on June 26th and I'm sorry, July 26th and July 28th, when that small area study will take place.
Okay, great. And I think there's one very detailed question on landscaping, and I'm gonna read it out and maybe ask Eliza to respond, and then Matt and or Alberto can add to it if they like. I think it also it's similar to the answer is multifaceted and certainly similar to the fact that there's different standards for different transect zones, and it's not a sort of a one answer fits all. But here goes, and we don't disagree. Since lawn irrigation is Florida's biggest water issue, and the drawdowns of aquifers through use for irrigation, along with lawn fertilizer, are damaging Florida's unique and precious springs, is Orange County working to improve its landscaping standards for new development? Since the developer takes out existing native vegetation, the builder should be required to irrigate the new landscape until established prior to sale of the home, possibly using a district irrigation system that would be dismantled after establishment and possibly recycled for another use. That way, the homeowner can irrigate only as needed and not be locked into paying for expensive water for ongoing lawn irrigation. For the developer, possibly the economics would make it beneficial to learn more about native vegetation, trees, which would help cool the area and take out CO2. With this requirement, the builder would have to select turf grass species that need irrigation only until establishment, plus reduce square footage of the lawn. So it's well intentioned and it's a good question, and it's a good comment, I should say. So I want to direct this to either Eliza and or Matt.
Yeah, I'll just jump in, having read through some of this, and then Eliza could add some more. That last comment on reducing some of the area is a goal for some of the Transect zones where we do end up with more building than landscape. However, in the landscape section, there is a focus on native species, and there are standards for establishment of landscape, and I think there's also a set of standards which Eliza or Greg at Canaan can help point to that has to do with I think some credits for reduction of water usage and landscaping, if I believe correctly.
Yeah, without getting into too much detail about the specific requirements for the landscape, we are certainly aware of the water issue that we're dealing with here in Florida. Big picture, the move towards encouraging infill and redevelopment, so we're not necessarily taking out native vegetation, is a positive move in that direction. In addition, thinking about reducing the amount of unused open space and really focusing on civic spaces that people are going to inhabit, playgrounds, places that people are going to use, rather than just visual green space that has to be irrigated and can't necessarily be engaged with by people, is another important piece. And diversifying the types of homes that people live in, all the way from apartments to townhouses to individual single family homes. So we don't have this focus on single family homes on larger lots, which tend to be irrigated. So I definitely appreciate the very specific comments in the question. And I think we're addressing that in a lot of different ways. In addition, the county has had for a long time requirements for non-residential development in terms of the amount of open space that can be turf grass, which is the portion of landscape that requires the most irrigation. And those smaller yards, and you'll see this, for instance, in the downtown Orlando area, that the smaller yards are much easier to plant with natives and low water types of plants because of the maintenance requirements.
Thank you. Thanks, Eliza.
So,
Marina,
just go ahead.
Go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, as Marina said before, there's multifaceted answers to some things, because some elements find themselves in the regulations, like landscape regulations, but some elements find themselves in other aspects that are not so clear. And I'm glad that Eliza pointed out the focus on usable open space and reducing the amount of or the demand for and the amount of open space that is kind of dribbled along and irrigated without being usable. So I just wanted to repoint out that these things land in different parts of the code.
I'll also like to just add that we're in the process of also adding a module to Orange Code regarding low impact development, and that definitely begins to play a role in terms of the diversity of the county, where those practices of low impact development would be a lot more effective or applicable or required in certain areas. And we're in the process of getting that going at this particular time. Cisterns, of course, in terms of recycling water, and bioswales, and the way that we retain the water within those developments, whether they are residential or commercial, is part of this analysis of calculations. But we also have Jane Gregory with us from Environmental Protection Division, and I'd like to know if she wants to add anything else on this level of the conversation.
Hi, thank you. I would just like to say, part of updating Orange Code is an exciting thing for the county, I believe, because it's offering us an opportunity to see where maybe some of our other ordinances could be made, better to work in concert with all of these changes. And when you look through this, it does reference our landscaping code, which is chapter 24. So I imagine we're probably going to be looking at that to see if there's some areas that, you know, could help with the water conservation. I'm sure that ordinance probably has some areas that could be, you know, made a little more efficient, you know, work better for us. But I think it's pretty exciting to see us incorporating the low impact development into this. And that's really all I wanted to say. Alberto.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Jane. So that, you know, someone made a comment more than a question, which is landscaping is essential as we look to redevelop the Pine Hills area. Adequate sidewalks and crossings will be important. We agree. There's essentially two questions. Well, the next question after you, Alberto. The first one is, how would you predict for Pine Hill condition to adjust for the better communities for the next 30 years and more affordable homes with all these maintenance? So maybe we should tell them to stay tuned for the Pine Hills workshop.
Yeah, and again, part of Vision 2050, this reorganization of the comprehensive plan takes into consideration all of these very important initiatives when we look at the growth in Orange County for the next 30 years, not only about housing affordability, which is critical and a challenge that we have ahead. And as a matter of fact, we have a 10-year action plan that we're currently implementing. Quite a bit of incentives from both a regulatory side of things have taken place, and they continue to gravitate towards Orange Code, as well as financial incentives for the development of that purpose through the Housing Trust Fund. So we have a targeted area in which translates itself of areas of access and opportunity, which also are areas that are suitable for infill and gaining access to those incentives for the purpose of development of affordable and attainable housing. That area is identifies all the indicators that are part of the Pine Hills community. You know, it is the major intersection. It ranks using that particular model fairly high because of the way the cohesiveness of the history of that community. And you know, we have a links station in the area as well, and there is currently some affordable housing multifamily developments that are currently planned for that particular area and under construction. So that particular community needs to continue to be focused in terms of this particular lens of infill and redevelopment and transformation of certain suburban conditions into the spirit of all of the effort that has already taken place through all of these visioning exercises that are part of the Town Hills, town center and neighborhood center areas.
Thank you. Alberto, one other question which has to do with what's the geographic area of the Pine Hills that the Pine Hill workshop will address, because there's 25,000 homes and all the apartments are on the corridors. I presume, well, is the area fully defined yet or not yet? And it will be defined over the next few weeks.
We are further delineating the study area, but generally it would be about a 1.5 to 2 mile corridor, and it straddles the intersection of Pine Hills Road and Silver Star Road. Thank you.
And then so one other question for you, Alberto, is what is the time frame for seeing the proposed changes, and what are the modes of communication are planned to gain more insight from residents?
I suppose the question is directly tied to the study area of the Pine Hills corridor, and
well, I think it's general.
Oh, in general.
I think in general, how is the public going to continue to be involved in this, in reviewing the draft of the code, presumably, and providing comments and or being afforded the opportunity to
Absolutely.
comment
So
on it.
Today, as it relates to Orange Code, again, that implements Vision 2050, is our meeting number 3 of 6. So we're halfway in the process of unveiling, if you would, the overall approach towards the implementation of this new code. So there are still 3 more meetings. The meeting tomorrow, as you have already explained, and I'm going to reiterate, will be very similar to today's. But then you can find the next 3 meetings in our website, and it's highlighted on the screen. Can you go back? I just want to miss a letter here. ocfl.net/vision 2050. So if you wanna follow, not only what's coming, but also what has already taken place. If you missed any of the Vision 2050 town hall meetings, and you wanna have access to videos or to the surveys outcomes of this effort, they are accessible there. If not, you can call the planning office in Orange County, and we'll be more than glad to share any information that you may be interested. We are also having special work sessions with the Board of County Commissioners that are coming up here. The next one is next Tuesday, June 15th. We will continue to do so all the way through the summer. There's going to be focus groups with the development community and others, and we've already started those. We will have also, as soon as we finish this entire public outreach and public engagement process by the end of the summer, beginning of the fall, we will also be coordinating public hearings, which of course we have to go through transmittal at both the local planning agency and the Board of County Commissioners, and then at the adoption, which also goes through the same process for both the comprehensive plan and Orange Code. So we anticipate this timeline to go all the way through December of this year, and then the adoption process will begin January, February of 2022.
Thank you. And I see Commissioner Wilson has her hand up.
It's funny because Alberto, I think, really resolved the question right when I had it, but I just wanted to make sure that people knew that they could go back, watch the presentations that were already live, and then still reach out with the questions if they had questions about that. Because I know that as this is going on, it's been really great to hear the questions that are bubbling up spontaneously, but I understand that probably if you go back and review those, you may have additional questions, and I just want to encourage people to continue the dialogue.
Thank you, Commissioner Wilson. That's a nice way to, that was the last question we had. I see one more, which is not necessarily a zoning issue, but will links representatives be available for public comment in the near future? Litter and trash left by riders is a major concern in the Pine Hills area. So lots of interest in the Pine Hills area, Alberto.
Yeah, and absolutely.
And growing pains, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. And please stay tuned. We will continue to coordinate with links, and that certainly, again, major initiatives, the same scale of the housing affordability level. We will continue to discuss the transportation needs as well as transit needs in the near future, and links is an intricate part of that conversation. So please stay tuned. They will be partners with the county as we continue to think of growth in the next 30 years.
Thanks, Alberto. I'm going to end, and then I'm going to see if the commissioners want to have the final word. I just want to say that Matt will be giving this presentation again tomorrow. I want to thank those who participated today, and I wanted to thank them for their good questions. Tell you to invite your friends and your neighbors to tune in. I mean, it may sound dry, but I think Matt's made it as interesting as it possibly can be, and it's very important in defining how Orange County can grow. So we encourage you to tune in again tomorrow. And I wanted to open it up to any of the commissioners who may want to have final words, or Alberto.
No, I just want to thank everybody. I'm not sure if Commissioner Gomez Cordero is still on the line or not, but if she is, please interrupt me. Or Rose Nancy, if you have anything to add to this, I welcome your comments as well. No, I guess no comments from the district offices. We wanted to, oh, there she is. Rose Nancy, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Alberto. Just wanted to encourage the Pine Hills residents. Great questions, keep them coming. Stay tuned for those of you who received an email from our office regarding the upcoming charrette that Alberto mentioned on July 26 and 28. Just follow through on your emails. Make sure you look for an upcoming email from our planning division to give you more details on that.
Thank you. All right, well then we'll see you all tomorrow. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Good night. Thank you.